He's a playboy who's all flirtation and no girlfriend, but when he met the girl in front of him, his heart was completely moved. That day, Annie had just come out of the shower. There was a strange man sitting behind her. She was shocked. Annie asked him how he got in, but the man took out a key. Annie asked him to leave on the pretext of changing clothes, but he didn't care. Annie had never seen a man like him before. Her roommate said his name was Carl. He was a friend of hers. She invited Annie to a party, but she didn't like the hustle and bustle. Hal taunted her about living like an old lady. Annie went to the party for the first time in her life. They played truth or dare. When it was Annie's turn, she chose to play dare, and the boys next to her started screaming at the top of their lungs. They said Annie wouldn't dare kiss Carl. Carl came up to her. Annie stood up stubbornly. They never looked away from each other. Annie was afraid of falling in love with Carl. She turned around and left, but the roommate had already filmed it. It was the first time Carl had ever been rejected. Carl didn't care about the ridicule. His mouth slowly curled into a sinister smile. It was hard for Annie to sleep at night. She'd only met him 3 times, but her mind was filled with the image of that man. In the classroom, turned into a debate between the two. Carl said that the essence of love is the domination of desire. If desire disappears one day, love would cease to exist, and laughed at the idea. In her eyes, love is eternal. It's a thing that can't be tarnished. But after class, Carl stopped by to ask for Annie, and Annie said that there was no way they could ever have any feelings for each other. She even lied about having a boyfriend. But Carl looked puzzled and asked, "Aren't we talking about a debate?" Looking at the man's smile, Annie knew she was no match for him. The next day, we met again at the cafe. When she saw him looking at her, Annie turned her head away, but Carl came over to her. He asked Annie to go somewhere, but Annie said they should keep their distance. Carl was known as a playboy, but Annie was the first girl to sit in his passenger seat. They didn't confess their love for each other. There was so much love in their eyes. They walked through a forest of shadowed trees. They jumped in the lake and swam together. She wore his t-shirt. He wiped the watermarks out of her hair. They quickly fell in love, but while they were together, they were discovered by their mother, who burst in. Her mother was furious, because it was supposed to be class time. She told Annie not to let a man keep her from her studies, and ordered her to break up with Carl immediately. But for the first time, shook her head in rebellion for the first time. "I can make my own plans for my life." Her mother was speechless. She realized for the first time that her daughter had really grown up, no longer under her control. Carl said he had a surprise for Annie. When he let go of her hand, Annie saw a neat little house. It was the first home he and Carl had ever thought of. He believed it was the beginning of happiness. The two of them attended their father's wedding together. Everyone praised his success, but only Carl knew how hypocritical he was. That's not who he was. He was just an alcoholic. Carl rambled on and on about the tragedies of his childhood. It was the first time he'd ever shown his weakness in front of an outsider. Annie was heartbroken. She was determined to heal Carl's heart. But a few days later, Annie saw on Carl's cell phone, facing Annie's questioning, Carl didn't know anything about it. He even chose to leave on the spot. Until late at night, he didn't come back. Annie went to the address in the text message to look for him. Carl was here. Carl said that's how their friends usually talk to each other. He didn't mean anything by it. Then he wanted to take Annie back. There was no problem. But then a woman suddenly asked, "Do you remember the game?" Then she showed Annie a video. Carl said he was going to make Annie fall in love with him, and then he'd break up with her. The video was so clear. You could even see the confidence in Carl's face. It was as if Annie could hear the sound of her heart breaking. Carl was anxiously explaining. At first, it was true, but now he was really in love with her. But Annie couldn't hear a word of it. She turned and ran away. Carl ran after her. It was all a lie. No matter what Carl said, Annie didn't believe it. They parted on bad terms. Looking at Annie's lonely and desperate figure, Carl's heart ached and he was powerless. He didn't know how to prove himself. Make Annie come back to him. Annie was crying in the car. The two of them were cut off from each other. She threw herself into her mother's arms. She apologized for being so naive, and then she focused all her energy on her studies. But Carl was in a state of remorse, listening to the songs they'd listened to together, with Annie in his head. Graduation day was fast approaching, but the teacher gave Annie the paper that Carl had submitted. Annie opened the paper in confusion, and found his picture and drawing inside, and all of them were addressed to her. It was a statement of his feelings for Annie. apologizing for what he'd said before, but the two of them can't go back to what they were before.